Welcome to the Leverage Your Influence podcast, where we talk to other creatives who are leveraging their influence, impact, and income through podcasting. Today, we're honored to have Dr. Albert Bramante, and he is a specialist in the area of mindset. He holds a Ph.D., and he is going to help us break through our barriers to help us podcast like a pro. Albert, how are you doing today?
I'm doing well. Thank you so much for inviting me. I'm really happy to be here.
Yes, sir. We're honored to have you on Leverage Your Influence. So, question number one, for those who don't know who you are, there's a quote that says, every person is just a name until you know their story. And so, in 2 minutes or 1 minute, however long you want to take, but you can't take more than 3 minutes, how would you define your story?
Well, I started as a psychology major. I've always been interested in the arts. I've always been interested in science and the mind. And so I've been just always a curious person. So the human mind has really been one of my areas of strong focus of curiosity ever since I was a child. So I majored in psychology, but I also had interest in arts and with actors and working with in the creative industries. And I really felt at home with like artists, entrepreneurs, people that really had the creative mindset and creative interests. So I became a talent agent, which I still do to this day.
Nice.
I represent actors for theater, film, TV, and commercials. And so I became just really interested in the idea of mindset. I mean, that's a topic thrown around, almost every circle that you go into, but it's such an important thing to consider because even for my work with actors, what I've noticed is the mindset is extremely important. And I've also been a psychology professor, so the mindset of students and the idea of success is really rooted in the idea of mindset, and it applies to podcasting as well. So I consider myself a student of life, and I always just like learning new things. And I particularly became interested in podcasts years ago, and a lot of times listen to psychology podcasts. So I really enjoy, just podcasts in general now.
Awesome.
And
Awesome. Well, for the podcasters who are listening or those who are thinking about launching a podcast and they're nervous about hitting the record button, how can adopting an actor's mindset help them perform?
Well, I would say number one, pick a topic or niche that's really you're passionate about, that you can talk for hours on. And what I would say is hit the record button and record something, even if it's a solo episode. And you don't necessarily have to release it right away. You don't have to live stream it right away. Just get used to hitting record and getting used to telling your message and getting your message across. That's the one way to start. And that will help a little bit ease of comfort into things. And when you become passionate about something, it is like a mirror effect, a snowball effect. Other people will become passionate about it too. So and then if you're gonna when you bring guests on, if you're a podcast host that brings guests on, I would reframe and look at this as a conversation amongst friends initially in the beginning. It doesn't necessarily have to be, all this extravagant show. And find your unique voice
Yeah.
because even as actors, one thing that is the same with podcast hosts is you're you. Don't try to be anybody else. Like I wouldn't recommend you be work to be Joe Rogan. Now, Joe Rogan is one of the most successful podcasters. You're not going to be Joe Rogan, here because there's only one Joe Rogan. But we don't have one of you, your listener. We don't have one of you. And that is what the world needs.
Yeah.
That's what the podcasting world needs is your voice, your vision. And look at that. Now there are some things you can borrow, and I definitely recommend listening to other podcasts and getting an idea of a format, but finding your own voice is important and finding your own approach because everything is different.
Yeah. Well said. So, when it comes to self doubt, what is a strategy that a podcaster can use before recording an episode? Because in their mind, they're replaying thoughts of, I'm not good enough. What am I doing?
Hmm.
Why did I talk myself into this? How
Right.
could you walk that person off the pod ledge?
Well, the one thing is that I would say is first, like, why do you want to become a podcast? That would be the first thing I would say. Why do you want to do podcasts? Because most of the time you'll hear, I want to get my message out there. I want to inspire other people. Well, if you don't hit record, how are you going to inspire anybody? And you're sitting on knowledge that other people could benefit from. You're sitting on pearls of wisdom that the world can hear and the world can benefit from. The only way they're going to benefit from that is by actually putting it in record and sending that message out. So action is important, taking action. Rather than, oh, I think I want to do this, hit record. It doesn't necessarily mean you have to go live or have to publish those episodes. I've known sometimes, I've heard a podcast host sometimes will record 10 episodes before they actually throw out one out there,
Right.
just to get the idea of practice. And I often say use the idea of self-forgiveness. You're a work in progress. So your podcast number one is going to be different than episode 100. Episode 100, episode 1000 is going to be world's step up from episode 100. So you're going to make mistakes. But that's a learning curve.
Yeah.
And it's the important thing also is to be consistent because I'm sure you've heard this, and a lot of one thing that really blew my mind, statistic wise, is I heard that almost 75 to 80% of podcasts don't make it past episode 10.
Yeah.
And that is almost a disturbing trend because you're spending time, resources, and even investing money into this. Why not see it through? And sometimes I'll hear, well, I produced 20 or 30 episodes, I'm not seeing any traction. And I want to reframe it like you've only produced 20 or 30 episodes.
Right.
Sometimes it may take episode 100, 500, even episode 1000 before you start getting that mark that really, set it up straight. And you never know when you have that viral moment.
Yeah. It's important for podcasters to fall in love with the process and to see it as a marathon, a pod marathon. You're doing it
Mhm.
for the long game. And every time you do it, you're getting better and growing. And that consistency, Malcolm Gladwell calls it those 10,000 hours where you master something. So thank you for sharing that perspective.
Yeah.
So, Dr. Albert, you have the perspective of an agent and also a psychologist. Sometimes
Mhm.
podcasters find themselves interviewing high profile guests. What
Yes.
advice would you give to them on how to navigate that interview without peeing on themselves?
Well, number one, they're human beings. We bleed the same blood, so treat they're a human being, and they agreed to be on your show, so they already take a step to trust you with their process and their message. And I would say just do your due diligence. Definitely research the guest. If they wrote a book, maybe read a chapter or an excerpt at least, so you can be on that bandwidth, but I would say approach them as a human being rather than fumbling
Hmm.
because they're there to give a message out. So, and that would say to relax as possible. Look at it as a conversation among friends, even though there may be a format. It's still, I would look at it like that. The viewpoint is this is a conversation among friends. You have a message, and I want to learn from you. The host, I would think, it's like, look at all these people you can learn from. And so, if anything, whether or not you go viral or not, you're going to learn skills that may help you in other areas of your life. So, and even for myself being like a podcast guest, and over the months, I've met so many great people, that I never normally would not have met, and I still keep in touch with these hosts on social media and also email. So at least look at it that way. Now you have this high profile expert who's about to drop some wisdom, pearls of wisdom on your show. they agreed to be on your show.
Right.
And so just be yourself and be natural with them. They're human beings at the end of the day.
Yeah. So, Dr. Albert, you have a book and you mentioned something called the happy file.
Mhm.
So, how might podcasters create a similar emotional toolkit to stay motivated when it gets
Mhm.
tough, when they feel like giving up, when they get feedback or things are moving so slow, they're questioning their pod existence. So, first of all, explain the happy file and help the podcasters develop their own.
Sure. So a Happy File is an actual chronicle. Some people call it the Happy Chronicles, but what I say is take a journal of all the good experiences, and in the context I wrote in the book for actors mainly, but anybody can adapt this. So let's explain it from the context from the actor's point of view, and then I'll go into it on the podcast point of view. So you keep a journal of all the good experiences, callbacks, feedback from auditions, performance reviews, audience comments that like your show moved me. So, or your performance moved me. And you document that when you have moments of self-doubt, you pull out your hobby file. So as a podcaster, what you could do is any five-star review that you get on, like let's say Apple or Spotify, or if you on YouTube, good comment, a host compliments you on your style, could document that. And even when you have a good conversation, but I had a great conversation with this podcaster, this guest, this is great conversation. I learned so much. And then when you have that moment of self-doubt where you might not see the numbers creeping in right away or the analytics are not adding up in a particular episode, I would take a look at your happy file and it will remind you of why you're doing this. And it's also, like I said, keeping in the long game, because even as social media influence, a lot of times one particular post or a couple particular posts may not necessarily do very well, analytically wise, but that doesn't mean that down the line. Also, as a podcast, the advantage of having a podcast, mid-podcast host, is your content is evergreen, which means it's going to be there forever. So maybe not right now, but 6 months down the line, somebody be looking up your topic on YouTube or on Apple and say, "Hey, I want to learn about leadership," or I had a great guest on mindset. So here you go. And 6 months later, you're getting a view, and that view may turn into things.
Yeah, yeah. So you discussed the fear of failure and how
Mhm.
a lot of us struggle with that. So how can podcasters reframe their failures? Let's say if an episode was terrible or there was an awkward interview that was embarrassing, maybe even went viral for the wrong reason, and they're embarrassed. How can they move on from that moment?
Well, I would say own it. That would be the first thing. And be like, even poke fun at yourself a little bit. Like, say, hey, that bad interview. But what I would say is focus it as a learning experience. You're learning. So if you look at, I mentioned briefly Joe Rogan, for instance. If you look at his early interviews, he's produced over thousands of episodes. If you look at his beginning, like humble beginnings of 2008, 2009, the show is a lot different. There's a lot of clunkiness in it. Now, you didn't notice it at the time if you were tuning in at the beginning. Another podcast host that I really think is a great model is the Diary of a CEO, Stephen Bartlett. One of my favorite podcasts. But if you look at his show from the beginning when he started, it's a lot different now. And so you're going to evolve. And what I would do is I would take each failure as stepping stones, as feedback. So let's say the interview bombed. Okay, what happened? And when somebody says an interview bombed or my performance bombed, that's very subjective.
Hmm.
Did it, sometimes I would say, did it really? And a lot of times, well, it's like, well, no, but I flubbed this interview or I asked the wrong question or maybe I offended the interviewer. Okay, well, that's your subjective. So what can you learn from that experience? What can you benefit from that? time and that work. So that would be primarily the thing I would focus on rather than dwell on the fact that you failed. No, you didn't. You're learning.
Hmm.
Now, that's feedback for your next podcast. What can you do? And there's situations out of your control. Sometimes tech glitches, sometimes
Yeah.
your sound, sometimes the camera can that's out of your control. And most of the time, an audience wants to connect with a podcaster who's real,
Yeah.
who has those vulnerable moments. So they're not going to necessarily misjudge you unless you're like really fumbling over and over again. And things happen in cycles. And also be prepared for that, uh, social media troll, for instance, that may come in there, or that YouTuber who might comment just to kind of instigate. So that happens. Even like again, the podcasts as I mentioned, Joe Rogan and Stephen Bartlett, they get a lot of criticism too. People don't like your shows. And you're not going to be everyone's cup of tea. So another thing I would have to shift to the stop is to refrain from the idea that you have to please everybody,
Yeah.
because you're not. You're not going to be everyone's cup of tea. However, your niche is going to love you if you're authentic and true to you. And those are the audience members that are going to stay, and subscribers are going to stay loyal to your show.
Yeah. Well said. So, Dr. Albert, you reference personality traits like the
Hmm.
big five.
Yes.
So, how can knowing your own personality trait help a podcaster be a better interviewer, a better listener, a better community builder? How does that awareness help?
Well, it helps you to know how to connect your guests and even try to figure out where they are too, because it's about matching. So, and the big five refers to openness, conscientiousness, extroversion, agreeableness, and neuroticism. Think of the word ocean, like the acronym ocean. So, with openness, as a podcaster, I would hope that you would be open-minded, because that's the important thing. Even if you have a set mindset or a set of beliefs, that you're at least open-minded to hear other and entertain other perspectives, even if you don't necessarily agree with it or not. So you have to be open to experiences, and conscientiousness. You have to be consistent, because the one thing that's going to get audiences fall off the map is being inconsistent.
Hmm.
So if you're the type that makes a commitment to drop an episode weekly, then you need to drop it. If you're going to do it monthly, then monthly. If you're going to do it, be ambitious and do it daily, then you have to show up and do it daily. So the idea is stay consistent and staying disciplined and focused. Extroversion. Well, no surprise there. As a podcast host, you need to be able to communicate and not be robotic like our monotone.
Mm-hmm.
And then agreeableness is you have to be coachable and trainable. So again, what I would recommend, especially, is get a mentor. Connect with other podcast hosts in your community. There's so many communities. Podmatch is great for that, but also there's other communities too, or masterminds that you can be a part of. So learn from experienced podcasters. I can tell you, some of the do's and don'ts, some of the mistakes, some of the things like that. And then neuroticism refers to, and it sounds a more harsher term than what it is, but neuroticism is how you emotionally react to stress. So people that are high in neuroticism can sometimes be very reactive and get upset easily. And what I would say is a good pod, or anybody, even if it's an artist, is to learn to temper that down a little bit. Because the way I did this, when I did my research on self-sabotage, what I found was those that were high in neuroticism and low in conscientiousness tended to be the most likely to self-sabotage
Mm.
and give up too easily. So the important thing is to kind of dial down that neuroticism a bit. You're gonna make mistakes. That's part of the process. That's gonna be inevitable. And there's gonna be episodes that are gonna flop. There's gonna be episodes that are gonna be really good. But there's also episodes that are gonna flop. And that's okay.
Yeah. Well said. So, Dr. Albert, can you break down the difference between toxic high self esteem and healthy self esteem and how that might show up in podcasting?
So the one word I would say one word difference in a simplified way would be humility, being humble. Now, it's important to have self-esteem because that's what leads to success. And you think that you're at least worthy enough to host a podcast, you're worthy enough to have an audience listen to you. With toxic high self-esteem, it's really related to fragility. And it's kind of related to low self-esteem. Actually, there's no real surprise there that low self-esteem and toxic high self-esteem are very related. So with someone, the reason why this is kind of a dangerous territory for any type of personal growth is when you have that high self-esteem, toxic high self-esteem, you start to think, A, you're better than everybody else. So that would be like me coming and saying, I'm the best podcast host ever. Don't listen to Stephen Bartlett. Don't listen to Joe Rogan. Only listen to me. Now, if somebody goes to criticize me, whether it's constructive or not, I would then, if I had toxic, this like of self-esteem, I would then respond with aggression. You're wrong. You're an idiot. You don't. So you're not open to feedback. And I sometimes see this with actors when I'm like, one of the questions I'll ask an actor when I'm meeting them. So who are you training with now? And so if I hear them say, "Oh, I have all the training I need," that tells me everything.
Yeah.
Because I would even think even an experienced podcaster, you're still learning and you still should be getting mentorship from other people. And so I think that's how that would should be the big difference is you're still learning, but you still think highly enough of yourself to put your message out there and that you deserve a seat at the table. And especially whether it's monetization or at least getting that out there is you deserve a seat at the table. And that is what it really will boil down to. Whereas you think you're better than everybody else and you don't have time for anybody else's feedback.
Right. Right. All right. I hope you're listening, all of you narcissistic podcasters. Just kidding. So, as we're wrapping up, what final encouragement would you give to a podcaster struggling with perfectionism and comparison in a noisy industry?
It is noisy, it is, but there's nobody unique like you. Just think of like all the news networks. What do news networks do? They read the news. Okay, so you're a podcaster. That everybody does similar things, but every newscaster is unique and different, and that's the same with as podcasting. You're unique and you're different, and the world needs to hear your voice, your perspective. So be you, and don't necessarily compare yourself. Then you can get the formula for a podcast. You can get the idea of things from listening to other podcasts and how to do interviews and how to do things. But you still should be adopting your own style of interviews.
Yeah. Yeah. Dr. Albert, let us know how we can connect with you beyond this very moment.
So you can find me on LinkedIn under Albert Bramante. I also, if you want to send me a private message, I can add you to my Substack. So, a Performance Corner is my Substack. I also am on Instagram. So, and you can also go to my website, albertbramante.com. And I do have some MP3s on confidence building and leadership, which may even help you as a podcaster. And they're like brief, meditation, hypnosis audios that you can download and listen over and over again at your own convenience.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Dr. Albert, for sharing those resources and for sharing your expertise and passion for performance for podcasters on the Leverage Your Influence podcast. We thank you all for tuning in, listening, or watching, and we look forward to sharing more value to you on our next episode.
And thank you again, and keep podcasting, everybody.
Yes, sir.